So I am connecting with you from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, a neighboring city in the neighboring state.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewanfo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
I came to Atlanta to attend the historically Black college, Spelman College, and I got my bachelor's degree in history there, and I went on to Clark Atlanta University, where I got my master's degree in history, and I got my doctoral degree in history at Georgia State University. I have 14 years of higher education teaching experience. I'm a scholar of American history in the 20th century. I do some 19th century history, African American history, women's history, and I focus on leadership, transnationalism, and a little bit about the scholarship of teaching and learning. I currently am an visiting associate professor of history at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology.
That's lovely. That's lovely. All right. Now we're going to be following you. Now here we just start and we'll follow the guest that is here. So we're going to start with your childhood. And we're trying to understand some of the things that led you even making the decision to study history. Why this, you might ask? Well, the important is that in this podcast, it is very important, our history, our root, where we are coming from, because we are trying to connect. This is not only for the people in the United States, whether you are in Canada or you are in UK or you are in the Brazil or in other parts of the world, as long as you are connected to the root, it is important for us that we try to have this conversation to talk about ourselves. If we need to cry, we cry together. If we need to shout, we shout together. If we need to be happy, we're happy together. All of us, we are connected with one rope. So tell me your childhood. You were born and you were grew up. What was around you? What was the thing that formed your identity? Help us with that.
Oh, sure. So I was born and reared for the most part in Birmingham, Alabama. My experiences outside of Birmingham, Alabama were in Nashville, Tennessee. Then I had a short stay in Kingston, Jamaica as a study abroad student in undergraduate, during my undergraduate work at Spelman College. So for people who may not be familiar with the history of Birmingham, Alabama, it has a very rich civil rights movement history. And for those people who are familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did a substantial amount of civil rights movement work in Birmingham, Alabama, in particular in the year 1963, because he recognized that Birmingham was one of the worst cases of what some people might compare to apartheid, right? Racial segregation, what in the United States was called Jim Crow. And so it was important for Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists like the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to fight in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama in particular, to bring about some more social and political equality there for people of African descent. So that's where I grew up. So I grew up in a city and in an environment where I knew very intimately about the activism of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth's. I grew up not far from 16th Street Baptist Church, the church that was bombed by a white supremacist, where 4 little girls, Black girls, were killed just trying to go to Sunday school. And when I look back on it, I was just about, 9 years. I was born just about 9 years after these things were happening, and just a few years after schools were desegregated, or at least there was an effort to desegregate schools. So, in certain ways, I was on the front lines of the post-civil rights movement struggle for Black equality, and that really shaped me. I was the first person in terms of generations to go into racially desegregated schools. And it wasn't easy. I had, in a lot of ways, this idea that I was struggling, fighting to positively represent my race, my culture, my people.
All right, thank you so much for that. I like the term that you use, post-segregated society. So that look a little hopeful now. Um, have we succeeded? Have the African Americans succeeded in what they were asking for? What were they actually asking for from the system?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, right? It depends on what what aspect of the movement you look for. So in general, African Americans wanted full citizenship rights as United States citizens. And an aspect of what they were fighting for was human rights. And they wanted, if you're talking about the civil rights movement, sometimes the goal was voting rights. Sometimes the goal was civil rights in the form of equitable education. And that meant, at the time, to the powers that existed, desegregating, integrating the schools. And a part of the point of that was to make sure that African Americans had equal access to a quality education. So if one was to delve into the history of the United States educational system, in particular in the southern states, those like the ones I grew up in: Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, are others. Mississippi and South Carolina, I didn't grow up there, but those are examples of southern states. One would find that African Americans, when they got, access to schooling, because legal access to schooling and to just basic literacy skills was forbidden during slavery, and at some points it was actually illegal. So once slavery was ended in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, and the 13th and 14th Amendments were ratified, African Americans got access to the educational system. But by the time there was pushback, white supremacist pushback against the gains that Africans were making in the aftermath of the Civil War, some of the tactics that white supremacists used to make sure to guarantee that African Americans were marginalized, would remain marginalized in United States culture, was to segregate the schools so that African Americans had to go to certain schools and white Americans could go to other schools, and then to do things like spend less money in African American schools. The facilities were markedly different. The supplies were markedly different. And you can find documentation that there was actually less money spent on individual African American students than on European descended students. So by the time the civil rights movement came around during the post-World War II era, one of the goals of the civil rights movement was, if you are interested, if your listeners are interested, to look up, say, for instance, the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, they'll find this was a major victory in 1954, 1955. And one of the aims of the legal team that was involved in that case and trying that case was to prove systematically that separate schools were inherently unequal, right? Because in 1896, there was a landmark case in which the Supreme Court said separate but equal facilities were legal. They were constitutional in the United States. But by 1954, 1955, the Plessy versus Ferguson case was successful in overturning, the Brown v. Board case was successful in overturning the Plessy v. Ferguson case because people like Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who were psychologists, came in to the courts and proved that separate was inherently unequal. So that's one of the goals of the civil rights movement. But many people frame the Black freedom struggle as a long struggle that started before the civil rights movement was officially kicked off and went beyond the well-known end date of the civil rights movement. So subsequent movements, like, say, for instance, the Black Power movement, had aims that were even broader, right? Like full self-determination for African Americans, the right to self-defense, right? So there are a lot of aims, but overall, it was full freedom and full equality for African Americans and people of African descent who were living in the United States.
I'm trying to understand something important here. Some people, they don't understand why there is a lot of poverty in African African American community, for example, because people think that it's just natural. Well, it is natural in that it has been made to be natural. Because if you fail to give people the kind of education that is needed, in one society, if you break up the education, give a quality education to some children and give inferior education to some other children, it is natural that you will get inferior results. So it has nothing to do with genetic. It's just part of the way the system designed it. So for that, it is very important that we understand that part. That it is not because the people were not really, because something similar thing was also happening in UK. I was interviewing some people that were brought from Jamaica to UK, and some of them were born. I interviewed a guy recently. He was born 50 years ago. He told me when he was going to school, it was very difficult for them to get into a kind of integrated school. If the British system find that in a school there were a significant amount of children of African descent among them, they will look for a way to kick them out. So what I'm trying to understand here is that what really is their fear? What are they afraid of? Because now we take up the issue of KKK going about to create violence in the African community. It's not because they are retaliating. They are going there to stir up anger, to stir up violence, to kill people. It's not because somebody attacked them, so they are going there to attack back. We look at now the system refusing to give education to children so that they can become properly useful to the society. Now we still have the same children not be allowed to mingle in a way that they can live freely in society. I can see that there is a pattern here. So the question therefore is, why are they afraid of African people? Let me put it that way.
Okay. So one, I think, very clear explanation that I have come across that addresses this question explains racism as cartel behavior. So it creates these groups within human society that are not inherent. So many people from the social sciences and the humanities will describe race as a social construct. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term or your listeners are, but you can look it up. It's called race as a social construct. So the claim is that there's no real deep scientific basis for the separation of the races. And in fact, where the lines are blurry, in terms of people being racially, quote unquote, ambiguous, it's very difficult to just use the characteristics that people say define race to tell if somebody is one race or another. And that the average fruit fly has more genetic differences than the human race. But some will say at the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, others will make other claims, but people who are experts in this field will pinpoint different times in human history to say race as we know it developed at this point. And it's a human expression. It's a human definition. It's a human way, developed way to rate and scale different people and put them into groups. And so at this point, when race, whiteness, and blackness emerge in the human family, then whiteness functions as a kind of cartel behavior that's used to privilege one group over others and to systemically design ways that allow one group to exploit the other to their own advantage. And so I would say fear is one emotion that's bound up in these types of activities. So like you say, the violence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the historical red shirts, skinheads, right? Neo-Nazis, the Nazis, but also fear, right? So you said fear, but also anger. So there is a rage. There is a scholar named Carol Anderson who has a book called White Rage that really systemically explains, scientifically explains how white rage, because of their stranglehold on political power, on economic power, on social capital, will express itself, has been historically expressed as laws and as customs that exclude African Americans or African descended people. If you're talking about Afro Brits, of Jamaican or African, continental African origin from certain schools. So that could be either by law, and in history and political science, we call that de jure, and or by custom, de facto, right? So the practice that you described, where people, it doesn't say right in the law of the land, it doesn't say outright in school policy that there can't be Black people in this school, or there can't be too many Black people in the school. But you look up and you see, say for instance, a set of rules, right, that say you must have a uniform and your uniform must look thus and such, right? The girls' uniforms must, skirts must be below the knee. And you have white students who have skirts right at the knee, and people say, okay, go ahead. That's right at the knee. And then the Black students, because on a social cultural level, there are too many, are given demerits and pushed out of the school, right? Oh, you have too many demerits. Your skirts were too short and they're right at the knee, just like Susie over here. So those kinds of practices, yes, emanate from fear, as you said, but also emanate from rage, because Black equality can't be tolerated in a system where the white cartel has to be dominant and privilege itself. And just, like I said, a systemic strategy. So planning, yeah.
I don't know how far we could really take that one deeper, because now the people, of course, that made up the United States are just, if we take out every other group of people, because in this case we are looking at the African American, but of course we're also looking at the European American, no? Which means these are people that are even living very close to each other, if we want to put it like that, no? Because if you take out the Mediterranean Sea, you will just bridge the land together. By that I mean, these people have been engaging for several thousands of years before the United States was formed. So my curiosity now, maybe it might be irrelevant, or I don't know how you want to look at it. We see that the Europeans are very violent against the African. This is demonstrated in very many places now. So the question is, one time I was thinking, is it because Europe came too late to history? Because when you look at Africa, see what has happened in Africa, civilization have gone to zenith. Europe was still there is very little you can actually write home about history in Europe, no? Is it because they rose up, they discovered a lot of things have happened, they are too late, so they are now angry to make sure that this part of the world that have always dominated the Mediterranean Sea, dominated the world that they become part of, will never rise because they have suffered defeat? Is that the ulterior reason why they are angry against the African people? Or is there genetic thing that shows to them that they are inferior to the African people? Because we need to look for a way to understand this fear. When Europeans treat Africans as inferior, it's not really that. It's not really that they think Africans are inferior. I think they feel inferior. That is why they are treating Africa as if they are inferior. It's like they are saying, if you don't hold them like this, they are going to deal with us like that. So I'm trying to understand, where is this fear of the European, of Africa coming from? Is it invented? Is there really any historical thing that we can trace to this fear? Because what is happening in the United States is just a manifestation. Because otherwise, it's what is also happening in Africa by the same European. They made sure that Africa never rise. It is happening all across. So that's why I'm trying to understand if we can pinpoint where this European psychological fear is coming from.
Yeah, so keep in mind, I'm not a psychologist. I have a colleague who that's her lane. And we always joke when I talk to her on her show that she always says, "Oh, Dr. Mccray tells us stay in our lanes." So I want to upfront say psychology is not my lane. I'm history. And so I don't know if I can speak to the psychology of fear, but what I can talk about are the historical elements that you brought up. So I have read the claim, as you put it, that Europeans were late. If you look from a world history perspective, a long world history perspective, Europeans were late to the game in terms of civilization, developing civilization as we know it. And I think entered my undergraduate studies of history at a time when there were what some people would term as culture wars over whether Egypt's this mutually agreed upon high civilization was out of Africa or not out of Africa, as one particular author claimed. And I was definitely on Team Africa. This was an African civilization. So, it doesn't follow, the logic doesn't follow that you excise it from Africa to try and underline, bolster this idea, this claim that African civilizations were somehow inferior. So, but I focus on a much more modern kind of take on history, a more modern view of history. And if you're talking about the use of violence and coercion to undergird this process of nation state development, that's an important concept. We can't take it off the table, right? And so a lot of times the narrative is, if you're talking about the United States, if you're talking about the British colonies in North America, that it was planning and foresight, strategy, mercantilism, right? So systemic economic superiority, right? That produced these mighty countries, Britain and the United States. But it's also important to remember that it was raw, naked violence that also helped to contribute to the development and the sustaining of these nations. So when, the Portuguese and then later the French and the British enter, during this age of navigation in the 15th century, when they're able to start to trade with West Africans, who as far as I know, as far as DNA evidence shows and family lore shows, and we can talk about why the documentation, I don't have the documentation, the written documentation to show that, but as far as family lore and DNA evidence shows, my ancestors are West and Central African. The dominant majority of them are. When Europeans entered West Africa, where my ancestors were residing, they did not initially have the upper hand in terms of military might, in terms of knowledge of how to navigate the areas. And so they had to enter equal trade partnerships with the West Africans that they encountered. Whether they were, the Ashanti Empire or what have you, the Fantis or what have you. And so if the Europeans, once they wanted to gain dominance, they had to first use violence, learn how to use it, and then employ it. And so a lot of times we're giving these historical timelines that just seem like magically the Europeans popped up out of nowhere and they just, dominated West Africans. But that's not the case. And if you look at even from the time that the first Portuguese landed to the time that they're able to penetrate deeply, deeper than these coastal forts and castles that they developed, and then colonize West African nations, it's 400 years. 350, 400 years. But a lot of times we get the history like, oh yeah, and it just happened. And so how do you think this happened? Particularly if there were West African regents who said, West African leaders who said, we'll trade with you. Yes, we want, what you have to offer, your rum, your guns. And we'll trade with you as equal trade partners, but you all you stay on the coast. How then would how then would Europeans penetrate deeply and dominate these areas? Violence. And they didn't have it right at first. The Portuguese arrived with these guns called blunderbusses that were not even as accurate as a lot of the West Africans' weaponry. That was more, as we might say, analog. But over time, they perfected and they developed the implementation and uses of violence to the point where they learned from the blunderbuss and to develop something hundreds of years later called the Maxim machine gun. So I think we could go off on a tangent and talk about their uses of violence in service of their political and economic and social dominance. But I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of what they do is not genetic, because like I said, I started out saying that I'm from the school of thought that race is the social construct. So this stuff isn't genetic at all. But if we look at the details of history, it's definitely very violent.
All right, thank you so much for that. All right, that is the last I'm going to ask there, so we can move to the conversation of the day. But of course, it's important, no? Because instead of just looking at it on the surface, we sometimes need to dig it up, so we can understand some of the bases. Because, like some people, there are some Europeans who think that they are seeing Africans for the first time. I mean, like they are seeing Africans as the last 10, 20 years. That is the first time African is coming to Europe. But of course, it's funny, no? Anyway, it's okay. We leave that. Everybody is free to be ignorant as much as you want. That is okay. Black History Bucket List. That is a tagline that I take down from your LinkedIn page. Help me with that. What does that mean?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Black History Bucket List is a hashtag that I was developed just to share some Black history facts and Black history memorabilia and Black history monuments with anyone who wants to see them. If you're on social media, say for instance, my main platform is Instagram, but I'll also post on Twitter, Facebook, about my travels and how I found Black history in, whatever place I went to, because it's not always evident and out front, let's just say at the Grand Canyon. And there's so much, and of course, Native American, indigenous people's history is there, and lots of people history of European conquest, right? Or the people of European descent and their conquest, but not as easy to find Black history in places like that. And so I decided, particularly, that it was important in this context, in this day and age, to put Black history out there front and center for anybody who wanted to engage with it. And the reason why I say in this day and age is because in the United States, we're in the midst of a time of backlash, I call it, against the good work that a lot of our folks are out there doing to inform the world about African people, African descended people, and the importance of their work in the United States, in developing and in sustaining the United States, and even in critiquing it, right? So that comes in the form of this kind of first critique of what is being defined as critical race theory, which is ill-defined by critics. And what they're really talking about is, any discussion of Black history and culture that may in any way critique this narrative of American exceptionality.
What does that even mean?
American exceptionality,
Yeah.
exceptionalism.
Yeah.
So it's this concept that somehow the United States of America is different, extraordinary, singular in its accomplishments, and beyond reproach in terms of its policies, in terms of its policies in the area of economics and social policy, in politics, whether it's domestic or foreign. So that's American exceptionalism. America is the greatest ever,
American
the best to do
supremacy.
it. Supremacy, exactly. And in particular, it's an American supremacy that's based on a kind of white supremacist nationalism. So yeah, it's a social media challenge to that.
All
Yeah.
right. Now, somebody that have this. Anyway, I just leave that there. I refuse to say anything more on that, so I don't become a little bit offensive. But so let it be. Now, the person who get hold of this hashtag that you have created, how can the person use it? In what way? Where do you want it to? How do you want it to be helpful to the people who finds it?
Yeah, for people who find it, I want it to be helpful in that one, they can just be a spectator, right? And look at it and learn some more about Black history, maybe a little known fact or a deeper kind of treatment of something that happened in Black history that they already knew about. But also, if they travel to certain places, that they can not only seek out these places, monuments to Black history, or museums that treat Black history in a certain way, but also I will throw in restaurants and businesses where they can get a taste of Black culture, of African descended people's culture, of African people's culture. So a person who is Ethiopian, right, may not, even if they're living in America, even if they're born and reared in America, may not self-identify as African American, may or may not, but this is an African country. And so sometimes you'll see me and I'm like, okay, when you're in Denver, Colorado, try this Ethiopian restaurant. It's really good. And this is, what you might want to know about the history of Ethiopians in the United States, or the like, right? So it's kind of pragmatic in that way. So even if you're not interested in history, you're one of those people who are like, yeah, that was 100 years ago, that was 500 years ago, what does that have to do with me? If you want to support Black owned businesses, if you want to learn more about the continent of Africa, African peoples, and the African diaspora, then you can follow Black History Bucket List and get that information.
That's lovely. I love that so much because here we pay a lot of attention to African diaspora. Our money, we're not talking about money today. You know, the money in the African diaspora, there are people that hate the African diaspora, that hate the African people, but they never hate the money. So, so here, I've said it a number of times that we should look for a way to control our money so that we can also develop our community. That is very important. So we don't need to be ashamed to say buy Africa, buy African businesses, promote your fellow African businesses wherever you are. That is very, very important. All right, now the term black history, African history. I think this is something that you have repeatedly used here a couple of times in your explanation so far. You want to make a clarification? Is one in the place of other? Are they exactly the same thing? Help me understand it, because probably there are some people who don't really understand it in detail. Please help us. You are a historian.
Right. Yeah. Because some of these terms are so vague, right? So Black can mean, in one context, people who are African descended, and then, the person who is of the Indian diaspora, right, from India, their grandparents were from India, will say, well, you know what, my folks were Kenyan. So, it can be complex, right? So in a lot of ways, I use Black as a synonym for African American. And in particular, sometimes for the most part, I use Black as a synonym for African Americans who are descended from people who were enslaved during the period of chattel slavery in the British North American colonies in the United States. So like 1619 to 1865. But I see and teach the commonalities between people who are African descended and whose ancestors or whose family members were scattered throughout the world somewhere else besides the African continent. So African diaspora can be broadly defined. Some historians say there are 5 African diasporas, and the first one deals with early migrations, human migrations out of Africa from prehistoric times, and then say that the modern African diasporas are number 4 and 5. And so the 4th African diaspora has to do with the transatlantic slave trade. And then the 5th African diaspora takes up during the period after the transatlantic slave trade is over, and has to do with people who migrate outside of the continent for various and sundry reasons, including to find work or to flee, civil war and famine. And that 5th African diaspora is evolving to this very day. So I use all of that. I don't do prehistory, but I tend to, like I said before, I include, say, for instance, Nigerian Americans and Ethiopian Americans in my definition of African diaspora. You mentioned Jamaicans, that I would also include Jamaicans who consider themselves mostly of African descent, because every other Jamaican that I meet has an Indian or a Chinese grandma. I always joke, right? So, I mean, same here, there's no so-called purity in my family, if there's such a thing. But I consider the commonalities that we have in terms of being members of the African diaspora. For instance, I have a classmate from Spelman College whose parents are Jamaican, but who left Jamaica and they lived for a time in England, and then they left England and they lived for a time in Canada, and then she came into the United States to attend Spelman College. And so we are sisters, of African descent who went to historically Black college together. but she may have a lot in common with, Nigerian people who settled in England, and she knows that, that part of her history and all. We have so many connections, and I think I like to focus on our commonalities without ignoring our differences.
Okay. Um, I want you to say one more thing regarding this black and African. Is it like maybe uh, a kind of when you use white to describe some European, and therefore European are white and white instead of European? In this case, black for African, Africans are black, so you use black instead of Africa. Is that in that context? So I'm trying to understand if it is possible that we use Africa instead of black. When we say black, we are referring to Africa. When we say white, we are referring to European. So I'm trying to understand if we, where is it coming from? If you can give me more background on that. If, okay, okay. What I'm trying to say is that um, if you organize a meeting in West Africa, Ghanaian, Nigeria, Senegalese, Ivorian, those terms, black is not going to come out in our discussion. Okay, if we organize another meeting, US, okay, not US, this case, because US is already in contest, say UK, Canada, Nigeria, and Congo, okay, maybe it might come out, no? So I'm trying to understand if it really relevant way to use black for Africa, white for European, or is it because it's easier for us to understand?
Yeah, it's just shorthand. It's definitely not perfect. I'm not claiming that it's a perfect designation. And, I'm really upfront about my positionality, right? So I told everybody I'm a child of the United States South, where, race is front and center and so much in terms of our identities and our everyday lives. And this idea of me being a Black person was definitely incubated in Alabama in the United States. So to explain to you how much I understand what you're talking about. So I grew up, I was born at a time when Black was a designation for people with my heritage. And about in the 1980s, the assertion, late 1980s, early 1990s, it was asserted that Black was not descriptive enough, particularly in terms of expressing our pride in our African heritage, which is a very important assertion that began with my parents' generation and was kind of taken to new heights with my generation. And to give you some context, like, if you found the wedding pictures of my parents, they're standing, they have painted my grandparents' patio white and put a Black outline of the continent of Africa in the middle, and they're standing on that to get married. Like, it's important for them to get married on a map of Africa. Whereas if you talk to my grandmother, she's alive to this day, 94 years old, she'll still say, no, we're not African. No, we're not African. That's not what they were taught. They don't think that about themselves. She'll say, oh, well, people used to say daddy's daddy, which would be my great great grandfather, might have been from Africa, but he was a wanderer and we don't really know. So her generation does not consider themselves people of African descent at all. And they really harbored a lot of the negative stereotypes that they were getting from the media about Africa and African people. So there's like a sea change in terms of how we defined ourselves and felt about ourselves and our heritage. In particular, then it became hard to deny, with the advent of DNA, right, science, that we were of African descent. So I began to self-identify in the late 80s, early 90s as an African American. Well, when I went on exchange to Kingston, Jamaica, the University of the West Indies, I was met with some hostility from Jamaicans. And they said, you're Black, just like I'm Black. You're Black, I'm Black. And I said, yeah. What's the problem? And they said, yeah, I'm using it as a synonym, girl. Like, yeah, okay, we're here. We were, our ancestors were, have been brought from the same port in Igbo land, and they were just dropped off at different ports. Yours in Jamaica, and mine probably in Charleston, South Carolina. And they were like, no, 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 no. I don't know who you think you are, but you guys were calling yourself Black, but now you're calling yourself African American to separate yourselves from us. You use African American to emphasize your Americanness and thus your, superiority, right? And so they're, I guess, drawing on this idea of, like you're saying, American superiority, American exceptionalism. And that I didn't think about that. It did not cross my mind. And so even though I had read that race is a social construct, and ethnicity is, it changes. Race and ethnicity, perceptions of race and ethnicity change in different places, right? They're different at different points in space and different points in time. So that story has both, right? Even I, in my lifetime, changed my racial / ethnic designation, self-definition. And then when I moved, when I went to another space, my race was perceived differently, and I had to self-identify in a sort of different way to connect with people there who might have had some of the same ancestors that I have, because my dad, his biological father, he says, is Jamaican, but he never knew him really. So I don't know I don't know if he really is. I don't know who he is, right? And my dad will say, well, his last name was Martin. And I'm like, well, that's helpful, Dad. Like, I don't know, so we might have a lot more in common than we think we do. I know that, and I came to grips with this idea that it's, for me, growing up, it particularly being put in these, on the front lines of the desegregation. And I should say I'm not front lines, second generation of the desegregation effort. A lot of times I would be the only person who looked like me in the room. And so I got in a subconscious habit of looking around to see if I could find somebody else to look like me. And so if you take that kind of basic behavior, I would say, Obehi, you know what? Hey, how you doing, brother? You look like me, I look like you. And I know that self-definition is a lot broader than that, a lot more complex, and changes a lot more often than that over space and time. So, like I said, I'm just trying to have to put a broad definition out there to connect with folks.
Mm-hmm. All right. But sincerely speaking, deep inside of you,
Mm-hmm.
do you know that you are actually from Africa, or is it because you just want to connect?
Well, I'm not, but I'm positive that my ancestors are. Very positive.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Now,
doesn't my hair look like it? Doesn't my skin tone look like it? My body shape looks like it. People will say, well, you bear the mark of Mother Africa. I looked more, I think, like a person of African descent. There's some little practices, right? I mean, back in the 80s, we would straighten our hair and, do things to look more like quote unquote normal Americans, which means less African. But I got very, very pointed about not doing that kind of thing, and definitely not being ashamed of my heritage. And then there are little things that are, they're snatches of culture here and there, right? That initially were defined as different. But as I grew more knowledgeable, I realized those were little things that my folks held on to, in a world that was designed to drill their African culture out of them and force them to assimilate to the dominant European and European descended people's cultures. They're there, right? So I will always tell my students, I went to this integrated school starting in the second grade, because kindergarten and first grade, I lived with my grandparents in Birmingham, Alabama, in their home. Thus, I was zoned to the same segregated school my mom went to, which actually never desegregated because the community remained majority Black. And so, because people are zoned to schools based on where they lived, the school never integrated. So my mom, because I remember one day the principal came out and he said, we get inferior things. He said, I learned our toilet paper is inferior to the toilet paper that they send to the white schools. And he held up this very, more like, post-it pad paper toilet paper sheet. And then it's more, luxurious kind of toilet paper that they sent to the white schools, even within our same district. Right. So then my mom was like, I have to find a way to get you to the schools that are integrating, so you can get a better quality education, because that's where the resources are being sent. So I didn't go to an integrated school until I was in second grade. And when I went there, one of the first things I learned was that my speech was non-standard, because I had been living with my grandparents. I would use words that older African Americans in Alabama would use. So an example might be juke. And so my grandmother might say, stop jigging in that hole down there. There might be a snake in there. And if I went to school and I said, well, stop jigging in that hole, right? Meaning stop poking or stabbing in this hole. Non-African American students would look at me and say, what language are you speaking, ma'am? What did you just say? And I said, oh, wait, this is not English. And I learned this is not standard English, right? So I learned to what we call code switch, right? And speak in a standardized way. So once I became a historian, I started to learn like some of these words in this African American vernacular, right, dialect, are actually holdovers of a myriad of African words, because my ancestors came from a myriad of ethnic groups, right? Spoke a myriad of languages. So there's no standardization. There's snatches, of words here and there. And so we learned about some dominant groups, right? So we learned about Yorubas, or like I said, the Ashantis, right? I had never heard of Efik people until one day I had a family friend who was braiding my daughter's hair, and she was talking on the phone, and I suppose it was Niger that she was speaking, but some of the words were in English and some of the words were in other languages. And she would switch back and forth. And the way she said her sentence, she used chook in the same way that my grandma would use juk in that sentence that I said. Don't be juking in that hole. And I said, oh, wow. I said, you use that word exactly the way my grandparents would use it. I said, what does that mean? She says efik, and it means to stab or poke. So yeah, I know I'm of African descent, Mr.
Thank you.
Obehi.
That is very important.
Yeah, I know.
That is very important. It is
Yes.
absolutely important. It is not a theory; it's the reality. No, there is
Mm-hmm.
nothing we can. There is nothing to philosophize about that. All right. Why I was also trying to stick on that for a while. That question is like you also. I think you mentioned of it in your explanation that when you say black, it doesn't really explain who you are. It just points to a semblance of how you appear. But we're not looking for a semblance of how we appear. We are really human beings. So we must know who we are. We must use words that explain where we are coming from, our origin, our achievement, our language. All these things cannot be contained in just color. There is no way it can be contained in color. But when you say Africa, it contains it. It contains all of it. It contains the geography. It contains the history. It contains the people. So that is why I'm trying to see if we can just use Africa instead of black. As a historian, I don't know if I'm making sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, you're making sense. And a lot of people who I respect and hold near and dear would say yes. And a lot of my colleagues and friends actually only refer to themselves as African. In fact, I remember at a party when I was still a student, one particular person that I met taught us a song. And the song is just, you sing in rounds. You know what I mean by rounds? Like one group starts, then the next group starts before the first group finishes. We are an African people. Whoa. And then, before we finish, the next group starts. And they do that until people get tired, because it was important for this group of people, my peers, to stand and say that, in particular when we came from families where maybe our grandparents and even some of our parents would say we're not. When other people in society might say, no, you're just an, bad word for black nigger, or, you're Negro. And in a way to say, and you're also subjugated to white supremacy. Um, but I think I prefer the term African American. I personally do, because it also tells what I feel like is important to do is for me to explain that I was one of those people who wasn't born on the African continent, but Africa was born in me because of my heritage and the snatches of culture that my ancestors managed to hold on to despite these overwhelming efforts to indoctrinate and assimilate them to white supremacy, to European supremacy. And I am not trying to appropriate or pretend that I'm anything other. I'm very proud because my African American heritage, the lineage of people who were enslaved in chattel bondage in my family, display a legacy of ingenuity, of tenacity against the odds, and that's also a part of who I am. So I'm not trying to steal or appropriate anybody else's culture. I'm claiming what I think is what I know to be my birthright, that was, forcibly taken from my ancestors, but I'm learning, and I want to be respectful about learning, not taking, my daughters, my husband and I gave our daughters African names, right? So how do we get these African names when he's a Southerner from the United States, I'm a Southerner for generations, and we don't know anybody who, we're not like, say, some people in the fifth diaspora who have relatives in Nigeria, who have relatives in England, who have relatives in Canada, who have relatives in New York, Miami, and LA, right? All of our folks are in these Southern states for the most part. And so then how do we get these names from books online? This has to be explained. So then when I say I'm an African person, but then I tell people, well, my younger daughter is Sikutani, and they're like, what is that? Well, first of all, how are you saying it? My oldest daughter is Ayodele. That's not how you pronounce that. A and B, that's a man's name. Why did you give your child a man's name? Well, in the book, it says you could give it to a girl or a boy, but thank you for telling me that. And I know to explain why she has a man's name, right? Not just Ayo, but Ayo Dele, right? So all of that has to be explained. All of that is part of who I am. And so I think it's important for me to say I'm African American descended from people who were chattel slaves.
Thank you so much for that. It's
Yes.
really powerful, though. Yesterday, I interviewed a Nigerian philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was yesterday. And we talked about language because, I told you here, we are really here to connect because we are one, we are together. Pascal Garvey have been saying this for a long time. It's just that people don't understand it yet, no? So we talk just language. Just by mention Ayodele,
Mm-hmm.
I don't already know that you are from, I don't already know that that name is from Nigeria, but I also know where it's coming from Nigeria.
Right.
This is what we need to do. Because if you give, the Europeans do exactly the same thing. And the reason is that they want to connect. But they did the opposite to the African American, just cutting them off so that you don't connect. Because when you connect, then you are powerful. Because when you connect, it means you are on the earth. This earth, you are standing on it. Not on the sand, but on the earth. Then you can be powerful. If you are in the air, how can you fight? So names are powerful. That is why also I was trying to repeat that answer for some time. In that, if we just limit it to the name that the Europeans give us, we don't have roots. But if we can manage to get to Africa, then you see the question I was saying before, that it's not really about how the white American treat African American. We need to go beyond that. Who are these so-called white America? They are Europeans. Okay. Now, what is European? Europeans are just the neighbor of Africans. You see, we are going beyond that. Now we can even go deeper and deeper again. We must always connect. That is where we get the power.
Yeah.
Now, how much, as a historian now, how much do young people in the United States know, even this an attempt to know about their root? Because I know that the Europeans are teaching it. That is why films like Harry Potter's are brought to the United States. History from Europe are getting there. So you cannot tell me that they are not teaching the children, American people, about Europe. But are they also teaching the African American children about Africa in a way? Because we are going to forget what the French were saying in their policy of assimilation. It was false. It was not true. That I interviewed a professor in US. He's originally from Senegal. So we're talking about the role of women in Guinea-Bissau war, the revolution. So, of course, before we start, like I did with you, I asked him some questions. Where are you coming from, your background as your childhood? So he was telling me that when he was growing up, they were told, like, of course, like every other person, because that is what the French did to all their colony, that their ancestors are coming from France. We're not talking of something that happened 1,000 years ago, only a few centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
So we must make a deliberate effort to make sure that we do not cut the link. So let me come back to the question again. Are the young African American children going to school be told that this is the minimum of their African origin? Help me.
Very minimal. Very minimal. And that's an improvement on what I had. And part of why I wanted to study history was because I said, why does you've added Black history to the curriculum, right? So I understand Alabama, state of Alabama, you feel like you're doing great. And you had me in your school, and then you added a little Black history about Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and slavery. But why does our history start with slavery when you teach us about indigenous people, to an extent, which is good, crossing the Bering Strait and all this kind of stuff. And you teach us about Europe back to the Renaissance and even beyond, but not about Africa. And so I'm at a disadvantage here. It's a very, very minimal, if at all. And the things that a lot of my classmates and I were going to dig up from the library. Do you know some of the teachers I had in the kindergarten through 12th grade system in the United States would say, well, I can't attribute that to your people. Oh, do you know about Mansa Musa? My understanding is that to this day, he goes down in history as the richest man in history ever. Do you know about that? And we had teachers, white teachers, to say, well, I can't attribute that to your people.
This is what you're talking about.
Yes, right. And so I feel I have a mission. And you asked about poverty, right? This salary is not an engineer's salary, but I feel I have a mission in the world, right? to do this. Yeah, I mean, it's very important for us to connect. And I was just thinking when you were talking, it's for me, it's important to say African American because I talked about my daughter's names, right? But my name, I have to explain, well, why it doesn't have the Y. I was named after the country Kenya. Well, do African Americans ancestors come from East Africa? No, no, no. I was given this name at a point when, African Americans were just learning and they identified with the continent as a whole. But, my dad said everybody was being named Kenya in his, everybody's daughter in his cohort, and he wanted me to stand out a bit. And so he changed the Y to a J. I have to explain all those things, right? But his name, when you're talking about what Europeans get versus what Africans and people of African descent might get within the context of imperialism and neo-colonialism and all this kind of stuff, hegemony, cultural hegemony. One, this evolution of culture happens to Europeans too, but they treat it with some sort of normalcy. So when I was working at the Atlanta History Center, I worked with a woman who was European. And we always talk about this famous baron of industry in the United States, Andrew Carnegie is how we say it. And I don't know why I said Andrew Carnegie, or somebody said Andrew Carnegie. And she said, why are you saying Carnegie? It's Carnegie, right? So that's an evolution of the pronunciation of this name, right? He doesn't say it exactly like, or the people don't say it exactly like his European ancestors. But folks normalize it over here. Like, yeah, it's American English, that's standard. Now, what you African descended people speak, that's, some people, say something denigrating, right? But I think it's important, and I'm very proud, even to have the conversation of how it came to pass that yes, my child has a Nigerian name. Yes, my child has a Yoruba name. And it's it's a man's name. And this is how the confusion came into the mix. And we're learning and we're trying. Because when I was in a history class with a Scottish guy, and, it's the first day of class, everybody's introducing themselves. And he says, I'm Roy McClimate. And I said, oh, Roy McClimate. That sounds so much like my father's name, Roy McCray. That's my father's name, Roy McCray. And, I didn't think anything of it. And if I was to bring my dad from the other room in this room, you're talking about looking, continental. The man looks like he's straight off the continent. So
that's good.
He does. It's a good look. He's a handsome man. And I get a lot of my looks from him, period. But he has this name, and I didn't think anything of it. And the Scottish guy in the class, Roy, says, Roy McCray, that's a good, strong Scottish name. And I thought, I love my dad and I love the things he did in our family's name, but I'm also glad that I'm kind of I have the freedom to change, to kind of break the cycle, because it felt funny. And I don't think Roy McClimate meant anything by it. And I kind of think he was trying to use it as a point of connection. But, for me, it reinforced that dominance, that European cultural dominance, that my dad, this, handsome Black man, has this good Scottish name.
That is it. It's a joke. It's a game. Yeah. And we need to start decoding it even little by little, even in Africa too, because in Africa we are not free too. But it's okay. Let's be connected to ourselves, because the fight is a long one, because it took Europe several centuries to put down Africa and break it into pieces. And what they did to the slavery, of course, know. It's not like they bring 100 people coming from Yoruba and they sent all of them to the same place. If that was how they did it, the slave trade would be broken very easily. Instead, they take, okay, you are coming from the Yoruba side, they take one. The other one is coming from, okay, let's take one. They are trying to mix it up. They are trying to break the connection. Since day one, European policy have always been how to break Africa, how to break the connection.
Mm-hmm.
because that is the only way they have to be able to dominate the people. Because if you don't break the connection, the people will realize where they are coming from. They can choose to stay or choose to go home. But if they choose to stay, they know how to organize. Because human beings are very sophisticated. We can organize ourselves. But if we don't even believe in the commonality, how can we organize?
Right. Right.
So now, talking about that, talking about history, as a historian, why is it important for the people in diaspora to know more about our history as African in the diaspora, also from Africa, also from our root? This is very important. I think we lay emphasis on that. Please help me on that. Of course, I'm telling you to say your profession now. Why is it important? Why is your profession important? Help us with that.
Okay. So I wanted to say a couple of things about that.
Please go,
The first
please.
thing, the first thing is this, right? Um, I don't know how many people know about the history of Black history, but you have to understand the context in which Black history or African American history was developed. So one, divorcing African descended people from their history and culture was a part of the conquest, the domination, the process of domination. It was the soft glove violence of imperialism, colonialism, and hegemony. And so it had a name during slavery. It was called seasoning. Once the African demonstrated signs that they understood they were not to think of themselves as a full human with a history and a culture, then they could be properly enslaved, made chattel or movable property. So after chattel slavery was over, a part of underscoring this, reiterating this idea of subjugation involved telling African Americans, well, you don't have a history, so you're not a very civilized people, because civilized people have a history and you don't have one. What what are you going to tell us? Our people captured your people from the jungle and civilized you and gave you Christianity and you're better for it. That's all we need to know. So in 1915, an African American man named Carter G. Woodson, he had a PhD from Harvard University, began to try and push back against this phenomenon by systematically studying African Americans' history, Negro history, as they would have called it at the time. And so he, saw that there needed to be certain mechanisms to systematically and scientifically study and document this people without a history's people, right? Or so-called people without a history. Um, you know, um, and people, you can go and look it up. Folks were saying, y'all don't have a history and culture that anybody is bound to care about or respect. So there shouldn't be any historical associations. There shouldn't be any books. There shouldn't be any courses on this. But Carter G. Woodson founded in 1915 the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And as far as the history of Black history is concerned, that was the impetus, right? That was the germinating a seed for African American history. And so the group got together, they were formalized, they had dues, they had local groups and national groups that developed to systematically study and systematically teach what was being discovered and published about Black history. So they started an observance, yearly observance in the month of February, and that was important because it was the birthday month of several figures, key figures in Black history, like Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, who was, responsible for initiating the Civil War that, as people would say, freed the slaves. And Frederick Douglass, a famous, formerly enslaved person who escaped from slavery, learned to read and write, and became this abolitionist, powerful abolitionist, helping to do away with slavery. So that was what they called Negro History Week, and that the first Negro History Week was celebrated in 1926. Negro History Week was officially recognized by an American president in 1976, so 50 years later. So these people in this organization, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, worked in the trenches to disseminate this idea that there was a Black history that reached all the way back to Africa, that people should be concerned about, who should systematically study and teach for 50 years before it was, really officially recognized by the United States of America. And then it became a month-long observance in 1978. And around this same time, in this post-World War II era, the Black Power movement that I talked about earlier, one of the concrete gains that it made was to develop at the level of higher ed, the systematic study of Blackness, of Africanness, and of people of African descent, African Americans. So the field, the intellectual field of Black studies, or African American studies and African studies, Africana studies, as it would come to be called eventually, developed. The first Black Studies department was started at San Francisco State University in 1968. So it's important to study Black history because it is seen as Black culture. Its culture and history is seen as a hallmark of a civilized people. And it's important. We shouldn't take it for granted that people see us as a people worthy of historical study, systematic study, funding, you know. So that's one reason why it's important, and then there are these other kind of, aphorisms, right? A people without a history is doomed to repeat, the worst parts of the past. So it's important to study history, to teach history, to learn history, so that we can not only see where we came from, but we can see where we're going, and we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. That's what I think. That's my quick
Thank
answer.
you so. Thank you so much. That's powerful. That's powerful. Now, another thing I'm going to ask you now. We are moving towards the end. Don't worry. We're not going to spend all the time here. No.
Okay.
Um, Now, you're a professor of history. You are you are connected in the university, which means you have a group of scholars now, which also means you have a lot of students who are looking up to you for reference. Now, for you, what is your own reference for African studies? By that, I mean, are you also, because you are talking of African study, a connection with some universities in Africa for reference? Do you have, do you need to use any books from Africa written by Africans to, or do you have to rely only on the book that are written by European or by other African diaspora about Africa? Help me understand that.
Oh, okay. I understand the question now. Yeah, yes, it's important to connect with scholars from the continent. And it was very important for me, once I became a history major, to learn from other people, from the continent of Africa. So I had teachers and mentors from the continent of Africa. Um, and don't forget, I went to 2 historically Black colleges and universities. So what one of the first people who told us as a class, about these holdovers in African American vernacular English that were so influenced by continental culture was a literature professor from the continent of Africa. Um, at Spelman, study abroad was encouraged, and study abroad in Africa was encouraged if you were going to research African and African American history and culture and heritage. I unfortunately didn't have the funding to go to the continent when I was an undergrad, and my efforts to study at the continent, haven't in on the continent haven't come to fruition just yet. But I thought at these HBCUs and even at the predominantly white, historically white institution, Georgia State University, I had some premium African continental scholars. So at Georgia State, it was Muhammad Hassan Ali, who was a wonderful scholar who taught history of the Horn of Africa and history of Southern Africa. Even when I went on exchange, I had a Nigerian professor in Jamaica, and we studied Kwame Nkrumah in his
Ghana.
writing from Ghana, right? And then we're always proud that he studied at an HBCU, Lincoln University, when he was here in the United States. We always talk about that. At Clark Atlanta University, I had Dr. I cannot remember his first name, Konde, Konde was his last name, from Cameroon. Emmanuel Konde. When that was for my master's program. And I even have some great colleagues who I'm always in contact with and talking with about a lot of concepts. Like we talk every week. Harry Asana Akko, also from Cameroon. It's a very, very important person in my intellectual life in terms of talking with him about and learning from him about topics that are near and dear to my heart in terms of the continent of Africa. So no, I mean, I think it's very important. Yes, initially, like some of the first textbooks I had were E.A. Wallace Budge, and there's a green book, I cannot think of it, but it's a European, scholar, and it was very important for us to move away from that paradigm.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
That is very important. It is very important also for the students that are studying history to understand the importance of connection. Because, like we have understood so far in your explanation, connection is very important. This is what the Europeans have been targeting so much, so that we don't connect. But now we can connect. We see that we can connect. So that the European who used to become the expert on African history, we need to take their job. They cannot become expert on African history. They should become expert on European history. The expert on African history must be Africans. Whether the African diaspora or Africans at home, these are the only people that can teach African history. Because like Dr. Ben was saying, history is not just dates. It's not just figures. There are emotions in it. A European cannot teach African history. So we need to pass the message on very well. And there are no lack of resources. Just like European universities, just like a lot of universities in the United States, we send students to come to Rome to study the Colosseum, take them to Egypt, take them to the war in Berlin, take them to Paris. I think they should also do the same. Send them to the Great Zimbabwe, to ancient Benin, take them to Nubia, to Sudan. I know, of course, it's not really their responsibility as it were, because if what they want is a people that they can dominate over, then of course they're not going to give them the instrument to liberate themselves. But at least there are a lot of powerful people in the community who can sponsor some of this project of research. Also, there are a lot of Africans that are coming from the continent. Some of them are very learned, who can be called upon. Hey, like for example, the professor I made mention of before, who is coming from Senegal, is a lecturer there also in US. So I'm not saying this to say that people that are in the diaspora, like maybe the African America, are not qualified. I'm saying that we need to connect. You teach me what you know, I teach you what I know. This way we will know more. So this is from the point of view I'm saying this. All right. Now, how can people connect with you? I don't use this moment to advertise yourself shortly. Please go.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can follow me on Instagram at Kr Mccray Ph.D, on Twitter at Kr Mccray Ph.D. I have a website, Kenja Mccray, that's KenjaMccray.com, where you can see I listed my publications and articles about me, other podcasts. So if you go to my website, you'll see all of that. And then the hashtag is Black History Bucket List, all run together, all spelled out, BlackHistoryBucketList.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Of
Thank
course,
you.
people they're definitely going to connect with you. I see an intelligent professor like this. Why not? They should need to connect. We are looking for the connection.
Oh,
All right.
yes.
Now, how do you think African diaspora or Africans in general, what do you think we should do to spread more positive stories about our history? Because this is very important.
Yeah, so I mean, what you were saying is very important. I talked about formal um, professors that I had. I talked about colleagues, but you're right. When you mentioned Dr. Ben's name, I was like, oh, I didn't even talk about or think about the informal ways that I learned history, like from a Dr. Ben by going to lectures, from a Theophile Obenga by going to lectures. So definitely attend lectures, and all those experts on African and African diaspora history and culture give lectures. Especially connect through libraries and through colleges, and get with professors who can bring their classes. And that's how I learned some of the best parts and pieces of, and most radical, right? Those that challenge the norm, those ideas from lectures. And nowadays, it's so much easier to connect because we have the internet, we have social media. So engage with your podcast like you're doing, and YouTube videos and things like that. It's just, you have to be careful about the source. It's always important to think critically, but there's so many ways that we can use, platforms, like I said, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, to tell about our history and our culture.
All right, perfect. That's good. We need to use the tools of the age and the tools that are available for us. So let's use it correctly, intelligently, not just go there and waste. Because a lot of people go there to just waste time. They're looking for something to spend their time. But use it
Right.
to educate yourself, help yourself, because nobody's going to help us. We're going to have to help ourselves. All right, thank
Right.
you so much. I really appreciate the time. Now, is there any other thing you would like to add to the conversation? Maybe a message to conclude it? I don't know. You can even do a shout out to your students. I don't know. Do whatever you like to conclude the conversation, just shortly.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I like that idea of shouting out my students. And I do say hello to all my wonderful students at Georgia Tech. And then the students that I still keep in touch with and connect with, that I taught for more than a decade at Atlanta Metropolitan State College. That's where Dr. Akko is. And my future students at Clayton State University.
Thank you so much. I want to appreciate it again. I can't even thank you enough. I really appreciate the time that we spend here, and I've learned a lot. And of course, the learning is never going to finish. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, too. I enjoyed it. And you have a new listener to the
Thank you.
Obehi Podcast. Take care.
Thank you. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.